Welcome back, Recovery in Christ podcast. Man, I had spent the last week in Mexico.
We missed you, bro.
Well, I was blessed with an amazing vacation. We might have some pictures here. I'm not sure what Carlos is feeling up to. But, man, I'm excited about today's episode.
Yeah, we have a great guest on.
Addiction is not a surprise to God. We've got to stop acting like it. This is Recovery in Christ, where we equip the church and bring hope to the hurting.
We have a very special guest, Carlos. Pastor Carl, tell us a little bit about our guest today.
Sure thing. So we have Mike Vaughn with us today. He is the executive director of Bethesda Workshops. It's a Nashville-based organization, and he specializes in sex addiction recovery.
Awesome.
He's recognized for his expertise in not only sex addiction recovery, but intensive therapy and marriage therapy.
All right, welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, guys, both. It is a pleasure and truly an honor to be with you.
Yeah. So we're kind of, the camera angle might look weird at home, but we have you up on a TV almost right above the camera. So if our eyes aren't centered, please forgive us at home. But Mike, first question. If you would, take 60 seconds and tell us a little bit about your background, credentialing, and what led you to work in the addiction recovery field.
Yeah, so I am a certified sex addiction therapist, or CSAT. Sometimes people know those terms in the addiction world. I've been a therapist for 20 years. I got my degree in counseling from a seminary that really it's a national seminary, but I was here in Charlotte. And then from there went into private practice, was in private practice for a really long time before taking the reins of Bethesda Workshops. That was in January of last year. So I was actually a small group leader at Bethesda for seven or 8 years, I guess, before I took over for Marnie Faree. And so that was a really rich time to be a leader because I had the chance to really be in the rooms doing the work, which I love, and still get a chance to do that a little bit. So that's a tiny bit about my background. So I guess therapist turned, well, in between there, I co-founded a private practice here in Charlotte. So therapist turned businessman turned, I guess, director is the path there.
Yeah, I will say our clinical director, Brianna, she's a LPC- mental health service provider. And when we told her that we were interviewing someone from Bethesda, she was very excited. I believe she's done some training or some kind of watch some kind of educational, and she just loves Bethesda, so we're excited.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad to hear that. We really, training is one of the things that we do, and even especially I think in the field of addiction, as you guys know, you almost can't be trained enough, right? And that's not to say that you should always be striving, but the training follows that. So I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Well, hey, before we get started, why don't you go ahead and maybe lay some groundwork here for those who are watching or listening. How would you explain sex addiction in layman's term and why it's so harmful spiritually?
Yeah.
Yep. Great question. So, addiction can sometimes be hard to define, but essentially sex addiction, just like all the addictions, is typically a compulsive behavior, right? Whether that's sexually acting out with others or, in the case of pornography addiction, pornography, which we've seen an explosion of in the last 10 and 15 years. So it's compulsive in nature, which means it's really hard to stop despite efforts to stop. Right. And not only that, but it has that neurochemical process to it, and that makes it even more difficult to stop. And so I often will ask people when they're trying to determine whether they're addicted to sex or not, have you attempted to stop this before? Right. And most of the time people have made some efforts because it's not in alignment with what they want their life to be. Yeah. And particularly for Christians, for sure not in alignment with what we know God calls us to in terms of healthy spirituality and sexuality. And so they've made efforts to stop, but those efforts have failed, right? However many times they have failed. Not only that, but the other hallmark of all addictions, but also sex addiction, whether it's pornography or others, is really damaging the people that you love, right? And so it impacts those around you. And I think if you use just those two things, that's a pretty good indicator that potentially you're addicted to this. The last thing I usually tell people when I'm talking about definitions of addiction is it's important to understand that addiction comes online to help medicate us against distress, right? Whether that's trauma or other distress. And so, it's important just to say there's a deeper component, of course, that we all understand about addiction. And Gabor Mate, I love this. He says, we shouldn't probably be asking why the addiction. We should be asking why the pain, right? We need to look below the surface. So that gets a little bit probably into what we're going to get into, but just in short, I just always like to add the component about the kind of deeper driver of addiction in addition to the behavioral elements.
Yeah. We believe that addiction, and as you mentioned, we need to focus more on the pain, because basically we believe that addiction is idolatry, and that we're exchanging the glory of God and His promises for bootleg substitutes that always fail us. And so with that, and I kind of want to see where I guess I could throw a stat out there or a guesstimation of a percentage, but I'd rather hear the stat if you have any. Probably a handful a year come to us just for sexual addiction. But what we've noticed is during the assessments and all these things, it's always the alcohol or the drug that's being discussed. And then once they get here, there's a porn addiction or there's a sex addiction. What would you say? Do you have any stats that correlate that of, how many people struggling with substance abuse are also struggling with some sort of sexual or pornographic addiction?
Yep. If you include alcohol in substance abuse, the best research that we have is that it's between 40 and 60% have co-occurring.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you would say that, Adam, because actually we experience it just the opposite. It's inverted, right? People come, of course, to us to address sex addiction. And then on their intake form, we find out, okay, actually you're struggling with alcohol or food or even other substances. And so, it's a flip around. But we have the exact same experience. And what we know in the addiction field, and I know you guys know this, is if and I think that number is much closer to 60, if not more percent, than it is to the 40%. It's just sometimes difficult to get those numbers exactly right. But we know that if someone's coming to us with a sex addiction or a compulsive sexual behavior, we are always going to inquire about other potential addictions, because once that process is set up, it's so easy just to jump tracks, right, to another thing. So if you come in and the process is already set up around alcohol addiction, it's so easy then for that to jump the track over into sex. And so they co-occur so much of the time.
Yeah.
So, when you just said that, Adam, it really kind of struck me that they come in thinking it's drug or alcohol, and then you discover later on there's a sexual addiction as well. What about, what would you say, Mike, to a spouse at home that may not even be aware that maybe their spouse is struggling with a level of sexual addiction? Like, what are some things that occur? What are some things they can look for so that they can get their spouse some help?
Yeah, we get this quite often. The partners of the men, at least, that come to our program, many times they're the ones that initiate their process, because they have discovered pornography on their spouse's computer. They've uncovered text messages between him and someone else, right? Even if they're not a sexual nature, but it would indicate, there's some kind of a relationship going on here. Those are the relationship indicators, like texts and things of that nature. And then the discovery of pornography on computers. Those are probably our two primary things that partners discover, unfortunately, rather than being disclosed to. And we talk about that a lot, because most of the time it is discovery, it's not disclosure. And that, I know we're going to talk about this, but that's what is part of what's so damaging is the discovery process. So to answer your question, it's usually things like that. So in other words, there are typically, not always for sure, because we know those that are struggling with addiction can be really, really deceptive. Like, they can hide things really, really well, right? So I don't want to mean that there are always signs, but when there are, it's a lot of times things related to either pornography on the computer or relationships with someone else.
Yeah, and I'm actually, I kind of want to just let the Spirit lead, and I kind of want to wrap these last three questions into one, and then kind of end it with, hey, share with us a success story that you've heard, so you can be thinking of that. But so often, and then I go to a larger church, and the pastor is my mentor, and he is a big advocate for men in the church, which also means that he's talking about things like porn and just the vast numbers of people in the church that struggle with porn, men and women. As the numbers begin to come out and the more, new data, surprisingly, the amount of women that are struggling with it. But I guess I just want to ask you, and the last three kind of rolled into one, and you can kind of ask a caveat. But, and I think the culture, as he was saying, as I was saying, someone's doing this assessment and they're not even thinking about sexual addiction or porn. It's almost like it's been justified and that it's okay. I mean, I've seen podcasts as doing research for this, how it's almost like, oh yeah, porn's a good thing. But to hear the statistics in church and the effect that it's having on men and women in marriages, which I'm hoping that we get to have you back for a part 2 and we talk about marriages, but. Talk a little bit about how that's affecting the church, how the church can respond to get help, advice that you would give, because it is not, I want to say, well, you tell us the data. Tell us the most updated data, and I think the church, a pastor, this podcast is really aimed to equip the church and pastors. I think a lot of pastors would be blown away by the stat that you're about to say, and some are probably going to be like, yeah, he's right on. So I know I threw a lot at you there, but just take the next few minutes and talk to us about that.
Yeah, in case the listeners are not aware, they're thankfully hot off the presses. Barna did research last year that they published around the new statistics around pornography in the church and just pornography in general in our country. And they were fascinating. If anyone wants to access those, they're easy to get. I'm sure you can go to Barna's website. Pure Desire also has it on their website as well. So just kind of to throw a nod that way, because I think it's really interesting. And I love statistics, so maybe it's not as interesting as I think it is. But, so to go back to statistics for a minute, from that study, 75% of pastors in this country said that they are working with people in their church around pornography and addiction and struggles. It is men and women. In fact, 40% of women report now being addicted to pornography.
40%.
Yeah, and that's always usually what people are so surprised by. Like, they think, well, okay, if you tell me 80% of men, I understand that, right? And it's not that high, but 40% of women, and the number of women, that number has grown, and the number of men, that number has grown as pornography has become more and more accessible. And now, we're past that point. But also, so that's pastors. So basically the vast majority, 3/4 of pastors in all churches are dealing with something related to pornography and addiction in their church. Yeah. Right. And so we know that pastors need to be resourced in order to help with that. The other part of that, though, is 65% of pastors say that they have struggled and 20% say they currently struggle.
Yeah.
And that's the number that's, sometimes sobering. It's like, okay, well, wait a minute. If my pastor, if my leader can be struggling with this, then what? And the good news, of course, is that 100% there's freedom available to all. But I think we do have to be, and I appreciate the question, because we have to be honest about the level of struggle. It's significant.
Yeah. We always say this, and you hinted at it earlier. Because we're a lot in a normal podcast, we'll have a "Did you know" section where we'll throw a statistic out about addiction, and hey, Pastor, did you know? And we're always saying that stat is low.
Yeah,
I think the stats you're talking about in the church staff, men, women, all, I believe those are low. I mean, one, because when I was going through an addiction, no one called and surveyed me, and if they did, I would have lied. Right.
Yep.
So I think they're low, but and then also my next point before we move too far, the 25% of pastors that are not working with someone, I just encourage you, after hearing those statistics, 8 out of 10 men in your congregation or 4 out of 10 women in your congregation, and according to these statistics that are low, are struggling with this. Get engaged, use this, get these resources, listen to Mike, and plug in and start shepherding.
Yeah, and I think we should probably draw a distinction, to be fair, between those that might be struggling and those that might be addicted. Those are not always the same thing, right?
I agree.
You can have people who are struggling and or they've looked a certain number of times, and
point.
with some intervention, it's pretty easy for them to stop. But then, of course, we're talking about this because, especially with pornography, what we found through the years is that so many have actually truly developed an addiction to pornography that in times past simply would not have. Like, they don't make up the typical profile of a sex addict. And that's why we have distinguished between sex addiction and pornography addiction. Now, obviously, sex addiction is the umbrella that covers all of it. But in the past, we would have known that people that were addicted to sex and compulsive sexual behaviors, they would have had certain family types. They would have had certain trauma types, certain wounding, right? And that makes it sound small. That's a pretty big category. But we know that with the proliferation of pornography, it's so ubiquitous, it's everywhere, that now people are struggling and truly addicted to pornography that don't have those backgrounds, right? No, there's no perfect family. So it doesn't mean that they don't have trauma, but it just means they don't fit the older profiles that we used to have. Sure. And I think that's important to point out for anyone who's listening, because if you're listening to this and you may be struggling with pornography and it may be an addiction, but you're thinking, well, gosh, but I came from a really good family and I don't have a lot of trauma and I don't understand how that would be true. The truth is that with pornography being as accessible as it is and what it does to the neurochemical process in our brain, you absolutely can become addicted to it without some of those predisposed factors.
Yeah, it's dopamine hits. Yeah, absolutely.
It's dopamine hits all the way.
Yeah, and I think that, I guess I appreciate you clarifying that, because that's exactly right. And I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but just based on what I've seen and worked with, I would imagine that the vast majority of people that do struggle with pornography, intervention, like local counseling, accountability, things like that, are appropriate steps. To whereas we're a residential program, that's probably not what's needed for the vast majority. There are, I believe, like I said, maybe a handful, and then it rolls into technology addiction as well, that they can't, have to have the phone. But there's hope. There's hope for this. I know I have close friends who are pastoring churches and living an amazing life that through confession and repentance and counseling no longer struggle with those things. So there's very big hope, but you do need to take these steps to have these interventions to work through, because secret sin will kill you. Secret sin, what's in the dark, eventually will come into life. And so speak on that.
Yeah, well, it just made me think the old adage, we're as sick as our secrets, right? We're as healthy as our truths. It's just, you cannot be all the way a fully healthy spiritual person and have significant secrets that you're keeping. Maybe any secrets, but particularly like we're talking about. And I forget the number, but the vast majority of people, this same Barna study, they asked essentially about kind of who knows that you might be struggling with pornography, and the vast majority said no one knows. I've told no one, right? And we know that addiction thrives in isolation. Like, that is the beaker for it to grow. And so I appreciate what you're saying, Adam. It really, the first step of the classic 12 steps, but of the process of recovery is really about admitting, hey, you know what, I have tried to do this on my own, probably without telling anyone, and that's not working. And so what I would say, just to kind of follow what you're saying, is it may seem like this big thing to tackle, but it's just those first few steps are just tell anyone, right? Tell some trusted person that is going to give you wise counsel. That could be a pastor. It certainly could be a counselor. It might be a really wise friend who has gone through it, or not, but someone that is going to point you to the larger community. Because what most people do, and I'll maybe risk offending people here, but Christians are especially bad about this. They just do that. It's just me and God, right? I'm just going to pray about it and talk to God about it. And yes, you absolutely should pray about it and talk to God about it, but God made it so that we have to tell other people, like you talked about. We have to confess our sins. We have to be connected to those who can do for us what we may not be able to do in that moment for ourselves. And actually, that's God's directive to us, is to listen. I gave you others around you in order to talk with them. Like, I'm going to use them. And so that's the hard part. It's the part that activates the shame. And that's why we don't want to do that. Like, I don't want you to know this thing that I already feel really bad about.
Yeah.
And when we get shame activated, we want to hide, and so we hide. But you know what? When shame's activated, you're more likely to use the substance, use the sex, use the alcohol than you are less likely to do it.
Right.
And so then around and around we go in that cycle.
That's good.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
good.
Genesis 2, it was still, all of creation was still perfect, in perfect unity with the Lord. And God said that it was not good for man to be alone. So you're right, in this design. And when you speak of confession to a trust, I do emphasize, and I'm going to look at the camera here, because there's also, the podcast is aimed at the church and the pastors, but also people struggling with addiction. And so when a trusted person, not just anyone, someone that you trust, someone who's walking with the Lord, maybe someone who's mature in his faith or her faith, but when you confess, when you bring what's in the dark to the light, it removes power from it. It really does. It's almost like you're dragging secret sin, kicking and screaming into the light. It is literally the scariest thing that you could do. So don't hear me say this will be easy. It is the scariest thing you could do, but it is also the most freeing thing that you can do. And so do that. Like that's where you begin this. Like, hey, and so we have an issue with the 12 steps. We're not 12 steps here. That's a whole nother podcast. But so when I say the first step, I don't mean like in some program or some list thing. I'm saying
Surrender
the way
to
that God's
Christ.
ordained it, the way that He's designed it. Drag that into the light. Let's drag it kicking and screaming, if so, because there's freedom from it, and that's where it begins.
Yeah, it is, but I appreciate you saying that. It is, for many, the hardest thing that they might do in their whole lives, is to do that. And the reason is the shame, right? So there's our own shame, of course. There's also, remember, this is always both a human thing, but a spiritual thing. And there's a whole nother level to this struggle, which is a spiritual struggle. And there's a whole nother enemy that is kind of waging war against us through this. And so just, I want to say that part too, because it's all of it together.
No doubt.
That's good. That's good. Hey, could you do us a favor and share maybe an anecdote or a success story that can serve as like a point of hope for some of the people who are listening? Some of these people might be watching and listening and thinking like, that person in isolation is me right now. Is there really hope for me? And take a minute to just kind of share some hope.
Yeah, absolutely. We, thankfully this job at Bethesda Workshops is so encouraging, because when people walk through the door, even their countenance, it's just so low. It's like kind of, Adam, you're talking about. There's so much shame and so much pain there. And then when they leave, it's like this weight has been lifted off of them. And so we have so many of those stories. And one of them, actually, a guy just reached out to me, it was a few weeks ago. And he had come to Bethesda. Before that, he had struggled for 20 plus years with pornography addiction. It just, in and out. Had worked on it in various ways. It hadn't, he just had struggled. It had impacted his relationship. They were on the verge of at least separating, if not divorcing, because of it. And so that had been his story before getting to Bethesda, and came through a workshop. And what happens at the workshop, God does incredible things, but that's only the beginning, right? So then we send people out with these recovery tools, and the rest of we tell them, like, the rest of the hard work really starts now. And so he left, and he's emailing me this story, and I've talked to him. And so now 8 years post that, he's been in recovery and free from pornography.
Praise God.
And I asked him, because I think I know how this works, but I want to know the story. And really for him, the story was he he realized at the workshop what we're talking about, which is you can't recover by yourself. You have to be in a community of people. And so he did that, right? He got into a community of people who were also recovering. He did counseling, like he did the things that we advise, and had worked them, in my opinion, had worked them really aggressively. And he'd be the first one, I think, to say, like, by no means was it easy. It was a struggle, and at the beginning, every day you're really having to fight for it. You're having to use all those tools. You're having to do the thing that's the hardest, which is call people and just talk to them about the struggle, meet with people. But he did that. And so now, he was sitting there after 20, it was more than 20 plus years, I'd say. He was 8 years free from pornography. Wow. And he just described, Mike, the difference between that 20 years of struggle and these 8 years. He's like, I have lived 2 different lives, in that time period. So that was just super encouraging to me, because it's like, not only did you struggle for so long, but you also now have been in recovery for quote unquote so long. And he didn't take it for granted. He's still doing the things we say, dance with who brung you, like keep doing the things that work, keep with those things. And it changes over time, as you guys know, in the recovery process. It's just one size doesn't fit all forever. But, and so he had done that. He had the flexibility to keep adding new things. And, man, you could just tell in talking to him the freedom that he felt. And that is what I think is so incredible. That when you get a little taste of the freedom from something that weighs you down, man, like it is just, you couldn't put a price on that.
That's so awesome. And so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to have a part 2. Okay. And so, guys, tune in next week. I want to talk with Mike about how this affects the family or marriages and things like that. But before we do, just because we know the stats, does Bethesda have online telemed type things and things like that they could use? Because we are located here in Middle Tennessee, and I know Bethesda is as well. But we have people flying in from all over the country to come to our program, and then pastors and other people from all over the country watching this. And so, tell us a little bit about where they could find your services, your ministry, your organization, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go to BethesdaWorkshops.org, we're pretty easy to find. On our website, we try to have just a lot of resources for people. We have articles, we have blogs. Our workshops are in person in Nashville, just like you guys. And we do have people that come actually from all over the world, have come in to work with us. After they leave, we do have aftercare that is online, so that is accessible to the people after the workshop. But in order to do the first step, you have to come to Nashville, and we know that just like for you guys, that can be a big undertaking. But man, so worth it.
Worth it. Easy flight to B&A, Nashville. So
it is. It's an easy airport to get in and out of.
Yeah, so awesome. So, all right, that ends this episode, guys. Tune in next week for part 2 with Mike. It's going to be a good one. God bless. Don't say ciao.
Ciao.